Deafening roars from Colt revolvers instantly drowned out the church bells as noon struck. In broad daylight, outlaws abducted the preacher's daughter, leaving only blood and alkali dust in their wake. While the town wept and the sheriff cowered in hiding, a nameless drifter simply loaded his iron to begin the hunt. The high noon sun of August 1882 did not just warm the Texas frontier town of Oakhaven, it punished it. Heat radiated from the wooden boardwalks in shimmering waves, baking the alkali dust into a fine, choking powder that tasted like dried bones. It was a Sunday, and the streets were dead quiet. Every God-fearing soul in Oakhaven was packed into the First Independent Church at the end of Main Street, seeking salvation from the scorching earth. Reverend Thamiel Abernathy stood at the pulpit. He was a man composed of rigid angles and iron-gray hair, his voice booming with the righteous fury of an Old Testament prophet. He spoke of the book of Job, of trials by fire and the endurance of the faithful. Sitting in the very front pew, her hands neatly folded over a worn leather Bible, was his daughter, Clara. She was 19, possessing her father's unyielding jawline but her late mother's soft, perceptive eyes. Clara was not the fragile flower the frontier often produced. She had hands calloused from chopping kindling and a spirit tempered by the harsh realities of prairie life. Outside, the town belonged to the heat, the horseflies, and a solitary man sitting on the shaded porch of the assayer's office across the street. He had no name that anyone in Oakhaven knew. He had ridden into town 3 days prior on a roan gelding that looked as road-hardened as he was. He wore a faded, dust-caked duster that had once been brown, a flat-brimmed Stetson pulled low over his eyes, and a pair of worn leather boots. Most notably, a heavily modified Colt single-action Army revolver rested in a low-slung, tied-down holster on his right thigh. The walnut grip was smoothed from years of handling, stripped of any varnish. He sat in silence, a rusted pocket knife in his left hand, whittling a piece of pine into a shapeless pile of shavings. He wasn't listening to the sermon. He was listening to the wind, and the wind was bringing the sound of thunder. It started as a low rumble, vibrating through the floorboards of the assayer's porch. The drifter stopped his whittling. He closed his knife with a soft click and slipped it into his vest. He didn't stand, but his posture shifted, coiling like a rattlesnake sensing vibrations in the dirt. 6 riders tore around the corner of the livery stable, tearing down Main Street in a tight, aggressive formation. They were led by Josiah Miller, a man whose face was half covered in a tangled ginger beard, his eyes wild and bloodshot from cheap whiskey and bad intentions. Flanking him were his brother, Gideon Miller, and a notorious triggerman known as Dusty Bill Higgins. They were the remnant of a violent, rustling outfit that had terrorized the Panhandle for 3 years. They didn't slow down. They spurred their foaming horses straight toward the church. Inside, Reverend Abernathy had just raised his hand to deliver a blessing when the heavy oak doors of the church were kicked off their iron hinges. The wood splintered with a sound like a cannon shot. Women screamed, men scrambled, and the holy silence was shattered by the brutal reality of the frontier. Josiah Miller rode his horse, a massive, ill-tempered bay, right up the wooden steps and halfway into the church vestibule. The beast snorted, its hooves clattering violently against the pine floorboards. Gideon and Bill Higgins flanked the doors on foot, drawing their Remington revolvers and leveling them at the terrified congregation. "Nobody move a muscle!" Gideon barked, thumbing the hammer of his pistol back. The metallic click echoed off the high ceiling. Reverend Abernathy did not cower. He stepped out from behind the pulpit, his face pale but his posture rigid. "You are desecrating the house of the Lord, Josiah," the Reverend said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Turn around and ride out before you bring a damnation upon yourself that no prayer can lift." Josiah laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "I ain't here for a sermon, Judge," Josiah sneered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the clean floorboards. A collective gasp swept through the congregation. Nobody in Oakhaven knew Reverend Thamiel as a judge. "You think a clerical collar washes the blood off your hands, Thamiel?" Josiah continued, his eyes locking onto the preacher. "You hung my father in Missouri, sentenced him to the gallows for stealing cattle that belonged to a railroad baron who paid you under the table. You took my family from me. Today, I'm balancing the ledger." Josiah didn't aim at the Reverend. He snapped his gaze to the front pew, to Clara. Before Abernathy could react, Bill Higgins lunged forward, vaulting over the first pew. Clara fought back instantly. She didn't scream. She drove her elbow hard into Higgins's throat, making the outlaw gag and stumble. But Gideon was right behind him. He struck Clara across the temple with the barrel of his Remington. She slumped, stunned and bleeding. "Clara!" Abernathy roared, rushing forward. Josiah fired his Colt into the ceiling, bringing a shower of plaster and dust down upon the altar. "Take another step, Thamiel, and I'll gut her right here." Gideon hoisted the semi-conscious Clara over his shoulder and hauled her out the shattered doors, throwing her roughly over the saddle of his waiting horse. "We'll be out at the old Copperhead Canyon," Josiah shouted down at the broken preacher. "You want her back? You come alone tomorrow at dawn. Bring the $10,000 you stole from my father's outfit, or I'll send her back to you piece by piece." The gang wheeled their horses around, firing wildly into the air and shattering the stained glass windows of the church. They rode out of Oakhaven as violently as they had arrived, leaving behind a cloud of suffocating dust and a shattered congregation. Across the street, the Nameless Gunman hadn't moved an inch. He had watched the entire scene unfold with cold, detached precision. He had noted the brands on their horses, the caliber of their weapons, and the distinct limp in Gideon Miller's left leg. He hadn't drawn his weapon. A shootout in a crowded church vestibule would have resulted in a dozen dead townsfolk. He waited until the dust settled, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the brutal heat of the afternoon. Then he finally stood up. Panic consumed Oakhaven. The church was a chorus of weeping women and shouting men. Reverend Abernathy was on his knees at the altar, his hands covering his face, his prayers reduced to jagged, broken sobs. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Wyatt Langdon finally arrived. Langdon was a man who wore his badge more as a piece of jewelry than a symbol of authority. He was sweating profusely, his face flushed, adjusting his gun belt as he pushed through the crowd. "Reverend, I was at the edge of town," Langdon stammered, looking at the splintered doors and the blood on the pews. "I heard the shots. Who was it?" "It was the Miller gang," a local shopkeeper yelled out. "They took Clara Wyatt. They took the girl right out from under the Lord's roof." Langdon's face drained of color. "Josiah Miller? Are you certain?" "He told Thamiel to meet him at Copperhead Canyon with $10,000, another man added. "We have to get a posse together." Langdon frantically shook his head, holding his hands up to quell the rising anger in the room. "Now? Hold on, just hold on. Copperhead Canyon is suicide. It's a natural fortress. You ride in there with a group of untrained shopkeepers and farmers. Josiah's men will pick you off from the ridges before you even see the entrance. We need to wire the U.S. Marshals in Dallas." "By the time a marshal gets here, my daughter will be dead," Abernathy screamed, pulling himself up from the floor. He grabbed the sheriff by the collar of his shirt. "You swore an oath to protect this town, Wyatt? You ride out there, or so help me God, I will take your badge and do it myself." "Thamiel, be reasonable," Langdon pleaded, prying the preacher's hands off him. "You don't have $10,000. None of us do. Josiah is a madman. We ride out there today. We sign our own death warrants." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the church. The men of Oakhaven looked at their boots. They were brave men when it came to fighting drought and locusts, but the Miller gang were professional killers. The sheriff was right. A direct assault was a slaughter waiting to happen. The heavy, rhythmic thud of leather boots against wood broke the silence. The townsfolk parted as the nameless drifter walked through the shattered doorway. The sunlight was behind him, casting his long, dark shadow down the center aisle. He stopped a few feet from the Reverend and the sheriff. Up close, his eyes were the color of cold slate, hard and entirely devoid of fear. "The sheriff is right," the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate attention. "A posse is loud. Josiah's men will hear you coming a mile away. They'll slit the girl's throat and scatter into the Badlands before you fire a single shot." Reverend Abernathy stared at the man. "And who are you to speak on it, stranger? Did you just come to tell me my daughter is doomed?" I came to make a business proposition, the gunman replied evenly. He hooked his thumbs into his gun belt. Josiah Miller has a $2,000 bounty on his head, dead or alive. Gideon has $1,000. The rest of them ain't worth much, but they're breathing my air. Langdon scoffed, puffing out his chest. Listen here, Drifter. This is official town business. We don't need bounty hunters turning Oak Haven into a slaughterhouse. The stranger didn't even look at the sheriff. He kept his eyes locked on the Reverend. You were Judge Abernathy. I heard what Josiah said. Which means you know how men like him think. He doesn't want money, Reverend. He knows you don't have $10,000. He brought you here to humiliate you, to break you, and to lure you out there so he can kill you slow. Abernathy swallowed hard. The truth of his past, the secret he had buried under years of scripture, was laid bare. I was a harsh man, the Reverend whispered. I sentenced his father to hang. I thought I was doing the law's work, but I was just a tool for greedy men. I found God to escape the blood on my hands. But it seems the blood followed me. The past always does, the stranger said softly. But your daughter didn't swing the gavel. Can you get her back? Abernathy asked, his voice trembling. I hunt men, the stranger stated flatly. It's what I do. I work better in the dark. I work alone. I'll ride out to Copperhead. I'll bring your girl back. What is your price? The Reverend asked. I have a small savings. Keep your money, the gunman interrupted. I take the bounties on the Miller brothers, but my roan threw a shoe a mile out of town, and he's too tired for a hard pursuit. I need your horse. The black Morgan I saw tied behind the parsonage. Abernathy nodded instantly. Brimstone, he's yours. Take my Winchester, take whatever you need. Just the horse, the stranger said. He finally turned his gaze to Sheriff Langdon. The lawman physically recoiled from the intensity of the look. Sheriff, you keep these people in town. Nobody rides out. If Josiah sees dust on the horizon, the girl dies. Understand? Langdon nodded vigorously, swallowing hard. Yes, understood. The stranger turned and walked out of the church. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He didn't offer a prayer. He simply walked to the parsonage, saddled the massive black Morgan named Brimstone, and checked the cylinder of his Colt. By the time the sun began to bleed red across the western horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the Texas plains, the Nameless Gunman was already miles out of town, a solitary specter riding into the darkening Badlands. The transition from day to night in the Badlands was abrupt and violently cold. The scorching heat vanished as the sun dipped beneath the jagged limestone ridges, replaced by a biting wind that swept across the plains. The moonlight was brilliant, casting the scrub brush and cacti in an eerie silver luminescence. The stranger rode Brimstone at a steady, rhythmic pace. He didn't need daylight to track Josiah Miller's gang. 6 horses ridden hard by careless, overconfident men left a trail a blind man could follow. He found deep hoofprints in the dried mud of a dried-up arroyo, snapped branches on mesquite bushes, and about 5 miles from Copperhead Canyon, a half-smoked cigarillo discarded in the dirt. He dismounted and knelt, picking up the stub. It was still faintly warm. They were close. They were slowing down, assuming they were safe. Copperhead Canyon was a massive winding fissure in the earth, flanked by steep, unclimbable rock walls. There was only one way in and one way out, making it a perfect defensive position. But the stranger knew the fatal flaw of natural fortresses. They made the occupants lazy. They believed geography would do the work of a lookout. The gunman tied Brimstone to a sturdy juniper bush a mile from the canyon's mouth. He would go the rest of the way on foot. He shed his heavy duster, leaving him in a dark shirt and a leather vest. He checked his Colt one last time. 6 rounds. He never kept the hammer on an empty chamber when he was hunting. He carried a heavy Bowie knife sheathed at the small of his back. He moved through the dark like a ghost, his footfalls completely silent on the loose shale. He didn't walk upright. He stayed low, using the natural shadows of the boulders and the jagged terrain. As he approached the narrow throat of the canyon, he saw the dull orange glow of a campfire flickering against the canyon walls deeper inside. He stopped and listened. He could hear the faint sound of laughter, the clinking of a whiskey bottle against a tin cup, and the harsh, cruel voice of Josiah Miller. But the stranger didn't look at the fire. He looked up. A gang like the Millers wouldn't leave the entrance completely unguarded, even if they were arrogant. He scanned the ridges flanking the canyon mouth. There, silhouetted faintly against the starry sky, was the unmistakable shape of a man sitting on a rocky outcropping, a rifle resting across his knees. It was Emmett Cole, one of the younger rustlers in Josiah's crew. Emmett was smoking, the glowing cherry of his cigarette giving his position away every time he took a drag. The stranger began to climb. He didn't take the easy path up the scree slope. He scaled the sheer rock face slightly behind the lookout's position, his fingers finding purchase in microscopic crevices, pulling his body weight up with agonizing, silent precision. It took him 20 minutes to reach the ledge. He crested the ridge just 10 feet behind Emmett. Emmett shivered, pulling his collar up against the cold wind, entirely unaware of the predator standing behind him. The stranger closed the distance in 2 long, silent strides. Before Emmett could turn, before he could even draw a breath to shout, a heavy, calloused hand clamped over his mouth. At the exact same second, the cold, razor-sharp steel of the Bowie knife pressed against the carotid artery of Emmett's neck. "Make a sound," the stranger whispered, his voice a rasping breeze right in Emmett's ear. "And you drown in your own blood. Nod if you understand." Emmett's eyes went wide with sheer terror. He nodded frantically, dropping his rifle. The stranger caught the weapon with his foot, preventing it from clattering against the rocks. The gunman slowly lowered Emmett to the ground, keeping the knife pressed firmly against his skin. "How many men down by the fire?" "4," Emmett stammered, his voice barely a squeak. "Josiah, Gideon, Bill, and a Mexican kid we picked up in El Paso." "Where's the girl?" "She's tied to a wagon wheel on the far side of the fire." "She's alive. Josiah didn't let nobody touch her. Said he needs her breathing for the preacher to see." The stranger pressed the blade a fraction of an inch deeper. A thin bead of blood welled up. "You're a long way from home, Emmett. Why kidnap a preacher's daughter? Why risk the marshals for a personal vendetta?" "Because it was a sure thing," Emmett gasped, tears springing to his eyes. "We didn't even know the preacher was the judge. We were just going to rob the bank. But we got a tip." The stranger's eyes narrowed in the darkness. A tip. From who? Emmett swallowed hard. The sheriff. Wyatt Langdon. The night seemed to grow even colder. The stranger didn't move, processing the information. "Langdon rode out to our camp 3 days ago," Emmett continued, desperate to buy his life with words. "He told Josiah that the new preacher was actually Judge Abernathy. Told him about the girl. Langdon said if we took her, the town would panic. He said he'd hold off any posse, give us a 3-day head start to collect the ransom and run. All he wanted was a 30% cut of the $10,000. He said he was tired of being a broke lawman in a dust bowl." It all made sense. Langdon's late arrival, his desperate attempt to stop the town from forming a posse. The coward wasn't just afraid, he was an accomplice. The town of Oakhaven was poisoned from the inside out. "I swear, mister, I didn't lay a hand on her," Emmett pleaded. "Let me go. I'll ride south. You'll never see me again." The stranger looked down at the trembling boy. He didn't enjoy killing, but he didn't leave loose ends. He shifted his grip, grabbed the heavy iron barrel of Emmett's dropped rifle, and swung the wooden stock hard into the back of the outlaw's skull. Emmett went limp instantly, knocked out cold. The stranger tied Emmett's hands and feet with the boy's own belt and a length of rope from his saddlebags, then dragged him behind a boulder. The lookout was dealt with. Now came the hard part. The stranger crept to the edge of the outcropping and looked down into the canyon bowl. The fire was burning low. Josiah and Gideon were sitting on crates, drinking heavily. Bill Higgins was leaning against a saddle, dozing. The Mexican kid was poking the fire with a stick. And there, bound tightly to the heavy wooden wheel of a broken-down supply wagon, was Clara Abernathy. Her face was bruised, her dress torn, but her head was held high. She was staring directly at Josiah with a look of absolute, unyielding defiance. The stranger holstered his knife and drew his Colt. He didn't have the element of total surprise anymore. 4 men in an open camp. If he started shooting, they would scatter and fire back, and Clara would be caught in the crossfire. He needed to create chaos. He needed to turn the darkness against them. He picked up a heavy, jagged rock the size of a cantaloupe. He took aim at the gang's horses, which were tethered to a picket line about 30 yards away from the fire, swallowed by the canyon's deep shadows. He threw the rock with all his might. It sailed through the air and crashed violently into a pile of tin pots and pans stacked near the horses. The deafening crash shattered the stillness of the canyon. The horses panicked, rearing and kicking, their terrified whinnies echoing off the stone walls. Down at the fire, chaos erupted. "What the hell was that?" Josiah roared, dropping his whiskey bottle and drawing his gun. "Coyotes! Wolves!" Gideon shouted, scrambling to his feet, his bad leg making him stumble. "It's the horses! They're breaking the line!" Bill Higgins yelled, jolting awake. "Kid, get over there and calm them down before they run off." The young Mexican boy grabbed a lantern and ran toward the picket line, his light bobbing in the dark. Bill Higgins followed closely behind him, cursing loudly. Josiah and Gideon were left alone by the fire, their attention completely pulled toward the commotion in the dark. The stranger smiled grimly. He stepped off the ledge, sliding down the scree slope in the shadows, descending into the canyon to deliver the devil his due. The night hunt had truly begun. The darkness near the picket line was absolute, save for the wild, swinging arc of the lantern carried by the young Mexican rustler. He was shouting in Spanish, trying to calm the terrified horses, completely unaware of the phantom moving through the chaparral behind him. The Nameless Gunman slipped into the corralled area, his mind coldly processing the battlefield. He didn't see men. He saw a deadly mathematical equation that needed solving. The hunter's calculus. Target 1, the lantern bearer, unpredictable, panicking, but illuminating the shadows. Target 2, Bill Higgins, a hardened killer with a fast draw, currently blinded by the lantern's glare. Obstacles. Terrified horses capable of crushing a man to death in the dark. The gunman struck with the efficiency of a striking viper. He stepped out from behind a rearing roan, his left arm shooting out to wrap around the young rustler's throat, cutting off his shout instantly. With his right hand, the gunman snatched the lantern from the boy's grip before it could shatter, blowing out the flame in one fluid motion. He dragged the boy into the heavy brush, applied a precise pressure to the carotid artery, and let the unconscious rustler slide silently to the dirt. Suddenly, the picket line was plunged into pitch blackness. "Kid, where'd you go?" Bill Higgins called out, his voice laced with sudden sharp panic. The outlaw drew his Remington, his thumb pulling the hammer back with a sharp metallic clack. "I said, where the hell are you?" Higgins made the fatal mistake of stepping backward, trying to find the firelight, his boots crunching loudly on the loose shale. The gunman didn't use his Colt. Gunfire would draw Josiah and Gideon immediately. Instead, he drew his Bowie knife. He moved seamlessly through the panicked horses, using their massive bodies as cover. As Higgins backed into the flank of a gray mare, the gunman lunged. He didn't aim for a fatal blow. He aimed for silence. The heavy brass pommel of the Bowie knife crashed into the temple of dusty Bill Higgins with the sickening sound of cracking bone. Higgins's eyes rolled back in his head. As he fell, his finger twitched on the trigger of his Remington. The gun went off with a blinding yellow muzzle flash and a roar that deafened the canyon. The bullet buried itself harmlessly in the dirt, but the silence was permanently broken. Down by the campfire, Josiah and Gideon spun toward the sound. "Bill!" Josiah roared, leveling his Colt toward the darkness. "Shoot anything that moves!" Gideon didn't wait. He began firing blindly into the shadows, fanning the hammer of his revolver, sending a barrage of heavy lead tearing through the mesquite bushes. Bullets whipped past the gunman, splintering rock and kicking up clouds of stinging dust. The drifter dropped to one knee. He holstered his knife and drew his modified single-action army. He didn't fire wildly. He waited for the rhythm. He watched the brilliant flashes of Gideon's gun, counting the shots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When Gideon paused to reload, cursing loudly as he fumbled for cartridges in his belt, the nameless gunman stood. He extended his right arm, perfectly aligning the iron sights in the dim, flickering light of the distant campfire. He squeezed the trigger. The Colt roared, a beast unleashed in the canyon. The .45 caliber slug caught Gideon Miller dead center in the chest. The impact lifted the outlaw off his feet, tossing him backward into the dust like a discarded rag doll. Gideon didn't even scream. He was dead before his boots settled back into the dirt. "Gideon!" Josiah screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. He realized instantly that his men were gone. His brother was dead, and whoever was out there in the dark was a professional. Josiah abandoned his bravado. He sprinted toward the broken wagon, grabbing Clara Abernathy by her torn hair. He hauled her to her feet, pressing the scorching hot barrel of his revolver directly against her temple. He dragged her around to the front of the wagon wheel, using her body as a human shield, completely illuminated by the dying campfire. "Show yourself, you cowardly son of a bitch!" Josiah hollered into the abyss, his eyes wild, searching the impenetrable darkness. "I swear to God, I'll blow her brains out right here. Step into the light." The canyon fell deathly quiet save for the crackling of the fire and the terrified, ragged breathing of Clara. She was trembling, blood trickling down her cheek from where Gideon had struck her earlier, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead into the dark, searching for the man from the church. From the absolute blackness, the stranger's voice echoed off the canyon walls. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, a deep, raspy whisper that chilled the blood. "Your father cried, Josiah." Josiah stiffened, his grip on Clara tightening. "What?" When Judge Abernathy read the sentence, "Your old man fell to his knees in the Fort Smith courthouse," the voice continued, smooth and utterly devoid of mercy. "He didn't curse the law. He begged. He wept like a whipped dog." "Shut up!" Josiah screamed, firing a blind shot into the darkness. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly off the canyon wall. "You're not avenging a martyr," the drifter's voice taunted, shifting closer, bouncing off the rocks to disorient the outlaw. "You're just a thief, dying for another thief, and Wyatt Langdon sold you out for 30 pieces of silver." "Langdon?" Josiah gasped, his mind reeling. The betrayal hit him harder than a physical blow. He set this up." "He set you up to swing, just like your daddy," the voice confirmed. Then, the nameless gunman stepped out of the shadows and into the perimeter of the firelight. Josiah Miller stared at the man standing 30 feet away. The drifter's face was half hidden beneath the brim of his Stetson, his duster pushed back behind the smooth walnut grips of his drawn revolver. He stood perfectly still, his weapon hanging casually at his side, aimed at the dirt. "Drop the gun, bounty hunter!" Josiah spat, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed his weapon harder into Clara's head. "I'll kill her. I've got nothing to lose." "You've got your life," the gunman replied evenly. "Let the girl go, and I'll let you ride out. I'll even let you keep the Mexican kid. You leave Texas and you never come back." Josiah laughed, a desperate, broken sound. "You think I'm stupid? You killed my brother." "He drew first," the gunman said coldly. "You're holding a girl who never did you any harm to settle a score with a judge who just did his job. Now, I'm doing mine." Clara locked eyes with the drifter. Despite the gun to her head, she saw the subtle, almost imperceptible nod he gave her, a silent command. "Be ready." "I'm walking out of here," Josiah declared, shifting his weight to drag Clara backward toward his horse. "You follow me. She dies." As Josiah stepped backward, his heel caught the heavy iron rim of the broken wagon wheel, half buried in the dirt. He stumbled, losing his balance for a fraction of a second. The barrel of his gun slipped an inch away from Clara's head. That inch was all she needed. Clara stomped her heavy leather riding boot down onto Josiah's instep with every ounce of strength she possessed, simultaneously throwing her weight forward and dropping to her knees. Josiah roared in pain, his arm flailing as he lost his human shield. He swung his revolver toward the drifter. The nameless gunman didn't flinch. His arm whipped up in a blur of motion. He didn't use the sights. At this distance, it was purely instinct, muscle memory forged in countless lethal encounters across the frontier. The Colt barked once. The bullet struck Josiah Miller precisely between the eyes. The outlaw's head snapped back violently, his gun discharging harmlessly into the sky before he collapsed backward into the dust, dead before he realized he had been beaten. Silence returned to Copperhead Canyon, heavy and absolute. The gunman slowly lowered his weapon. He stood still for a long moment, watching the bodies to ensure the fight was truly over. Then, he holstered his weapon and walked over to Clara. He drew his Bowie knife and quickly sliced through the heavy ropes binding her wrists. Clara rubbed her chafed arms, staring at the dead outlaw, then up at the stranger. She didn't cry. She took a deep, shuddering breath and squared her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. Don't thank me yet," the drifter said, his eyes hard as slate. "We have a reckoning back in town." Dawn was breaking over Oakhaven, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and crimson. Sheriff Wyatt Langdon was sitting in the office of the jailhouse, drinking a cup of bitter, day-old coffee. His bags were packed and sitting by the door. He was waiting for the sun to rise fully before he organized the posse, a posse he planned to lead in the wrong direction, giving the Millers plenty of time to escape. Tomorrow he'd collect his cut, turn in his badge, and head for San Francisco. The rhythmic sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered his reverie. Langdon stood up, looking out the barred window. 2 horses were riding slowly down the center of Main Street. On the black Morgan was the nameless drifter. Riding alongside him on Josiah Miller's massive bay was Clara Abernathy. The coffee cup slipped from Langdon's hand, shattering on the floorboards. The townspeople began to emerge from their homes and businesses, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the street. Reverend Abernathy burst out of the church doors, running toward them with tears streaming down his face. "Clara! Oh, merciful God, Clara!" The Reverend pulled his daughter down from the horse, holding her as if he would never let her go. The Nameless Gunman didn't dismount. He stared directly at the sheriff's office. Langdon, sweating profusely, stepped out onto the boardwalk, his hand resting nervously on the butt of his sidearm. "Well, I'll be damned," Langdon forced a nervous chuckle, playing to the gathering crowd. "You actually did it, stranger. You brought her back." The drifter reached behind his saddle and unhooked a heavy burlap sack. He tossed it into the dust at Langdon's feet. It landed with a heavy metallic clatter. The sack fell open, spilling Josiah Miller's silver-studded gun belt and Gideon's engraved Remington into the street. "Josiah Miller is dead," the drifter said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "Gideon is dead. Emmett Cole is tied up out at the canyon, waiting for a federal marshal." "Excellent work," Langdon stammered, his face pale. "The town owes you a debt of gratitude. Come inside, I'll write up a voucher for the bounties." "I didn't come for the town's money," the gunman replied softly. "I came for yours, Wyatt. 30% of $10,000, wasn't it?" The crowd gasped. Reverend Abernathy turned, his eyes wide with shock, looking from the drifter to the sheriff. What is he talking about?" Langdon stuttered, taking a step back. "This man is crazy, Thamiel. He's a killer." "Emmett Cole has a loud mouth when there's a knife against his throat," the drifter stated loudly, ensuring every citizen in Oakhaven heard him. "He told me who rode out to their camp. He told me who tipped them off about the judge's past and who planned the kidnapping to extort the town." The townspeople began to back away from Langdon, their expressions morphing from shock to absolute fury. Langdon's eyes darted around like a trapped rat. The jig was up. He saw the hatred in the eyes of the people he was sworn to protect. Panic completely overrode his reason. With a desperate scream, Langdon drew his revolver, aiming squarely at the drifter's chest. He never even cocked the hammer. The drifter's draw was a fluid, practiced motion that defied the eye. A single shot thundered through Main Street. Sheriff Wyatt Langdon looked down at the blossoming red stain on his tin star. He dropped his gun, fell to his knees in the alkali dust, and collapsed face forward into the street. The drifter calmly ejected the spent shell casing from his Colt, replacing it with a fresh cartridge from his belt. He snapped the loading gate shut and holstered the weapon. He looked down at Reverend Abernathy, who was staring in stunned silence at the dead lawman. "The ledger is balanced, Judge," the Nameless Gunman said softly. He didn't wait for thanks, and he didn't ask for his bounty. He turned the massive black Morgan around and rode out of Oakhaven, heading west toward the rising heat, just another nameless shadow swallowed by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the frontier. If you felt the heat of the alkali dust in your lungs, the metallic click of a Colt's hammer, and the sheer thrill of a midnight showdown in Copperhead Canyon, then don't ride off into the sunset just yet. Hit that like button to pay the bounty, share this tale with your fellow frontier wanderers, and subscribe to the channel for more gritty, gun-smoking audio dramas. Keep your iron loaded, and we'll see you on the next trail.